they were burning everything that you could think of. They were burning body parts from the hospital.
The single job that was most often proposed to me was proposed by people over there fighting.
Here's a list of diseases. If you were in Iraq, you're gonna and you get one of these things, we're not gonna make you try and prove that it's service connected. We're just gonna go ahead and take care of you. By Vietnam, DAV helped fund the research that led to PTSD being recognized as a condition.
I'm such a fan of what your organization has done. I know you're not the only ones in this space, but you've been around for a long time. And I guess maybe the sensible thing to do is just say a few words to folks who sort of know of you, but don't really understand how the DAV evolved and why it's so important today.
Yeah, well, we came out of the trenches of World War I. I mean, that's where we trace our roots. It was folks who'd been, through the first kind of mechanical war. They'd endured gas strikes, mustard gas attacks. They'd lived in trenches for a long period of time. They suffered brain injuries and a lot of the stuff that we see now. But of course, the care was so much worse back then. And then they were returning home to jobs that were, extremely physically demanding. So I think coming out of, 1920, DAV was founded. The thought at the time was, we have to get together and take care of ourselves because no one else is going to take care of us. There's no VA.
Right?
There's no VA. Yeah, there's some great programs on the state level in some states, but it was all a hodgepodge, kind of a patchwork of support structures out there. And thank God we're past that in terms of how many great organizations there are helping folks. But I think from the get-go, DAV's always been, we've talked about, well, what's the promise that we have to people who serve? What do we actually owe them? It's an honor to serve in the military, but if you're changed, really where the promise is we owe you to get back as close to normal as we can. And when you look at people like you've talked, Travis Mills is a good friend of yours. You could never repay Travis Mills for what he sacrificed for our country.
Wow. And really, dude, doesn't it? I mean, it's not just that, but so many people wind up feeling foolish and futile for even trying. Like, how do you even say, I mean, thanks for your service doesn't quite cut it. Thanks for forming a foundation and walking the walk gets a little bit closer. But when you really look at the totality of what that guy has done, and many others like him, language fails me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've never experienced anything remotely close, and most people haven't, to what Travis experienced. I think it's really like there's thank you for your service is nice, but thank you for your service. Here's the ability to take care of your family. Thank you for your service. Here's a job that you can do that you'll feel good about the impact of your job. Here's just the start. We're just going to get you started towards starting your own company, towards starting, towards meaningful career. All those things can make a huge difference. And we were talking about before with Chuck, it's really about people finding meaning in what they're doing, and you get a lot of meaning when you're in the military. You experience a sense of teamwork and camaraderie that's unique, but when you get out, that's all kind of taken away from you. And in the case of someone like Travis, what are you going to do after that? You can't stay in the military. You're going to have to figure something out.
I talk a lot about this idea of a reverse boot camp, right? Because there's people understand basic, they understand boot camp, and they understand the unassailable logic of taking a civilian and turning him or her into a warrior. It's not going to happen with a flick of a switch. But to come back to civilian life without something similar, right? That seems to be just magical thinking. And really, before we talk about what's going on right now and the incredible work you guys do helping people navigate through the miasma that is the VA, unfortunately, in so many ways, can we go back to the First World War for just a second? Because, I mean, I don't know if there's ever been a more terrible, more gut-wrenching, awful conflict ever. I mean, I know all war is a hell of a thing, but in my mind, that really was the war to end all wars, except, of course, it didn't. And the idea that there was no VA and the idea that people were coming back, like we didn't have PTSD back then, at least not by that name. I think they called it, what was it, shell shock, right?
Yeah, there were a bunch of names for it. Yeah, shell shock. There was there were all these disorders that they would assign you.
Yes.
Yeah, nervous disorders. Yeah, your
Battle fatigue.
battle fatigue. And I mean we experienced that coming out of World War I, and then the World War I, veterans were coming up when people were coming out of World War II. And finally, by Vietnam, DAV helped fund the research that led to PTSD being recognized as a condition. And a lot of people now will challenge, well, do we want to call it a disorder? Is it just post-traumatic stress, or is it post-traumatic stress disorder? And so you can get into the language choices of that. But until we had PTSD, we didn't have kind of that funnel where we could start taking care of people from a benefits perspective, make sure that they get, they're able to care for their basic needs. And also, I think people were just afraid of that kind of treatment. Coming out of World War I, there's no way on earth you wanted to be someone who would be considered a coward, possibly, if you're complaining about trauma or someone who's crazy. I mean, coming out of World War I, if you think about it, you didn't want to be disfigured. You didn't want to look disfigured and go out in public. You were shamed for doing that. And that, the lessons we've learned are it's great. And there's still further to go, but you're absolutely right. When you think about the cost of World War I, what people went through, we're doing so much better as a country right now. I ended up getting hired. A buddy from the Marine Corps worked for DAV, came to work for DAV. I still wanted to go. I transferred to Ohio for the Guard, and I was finally able to get orders to go in 2007. So
where were you exactly?
I was at Balad. Balad was Balad Anaconda. If you're in the Army, you called it Anaconda. It was kind of a dual base. One of the biggest bases in Iraq, and that's where everyone who was medically evacuated out of the theater went for their care. They stabilized the patients, got them out to Landstuhl, and then got them stateside. So it was, I wasn't really happy with it. I wanted a little bit of a different kind of military tour. I didn't want to necessarily be in a hospital the whole time, or that was where I spent a good amount of my time. But it was an important place because that was where you don't get to see a whole lot of the war beyond incoming. When you're at Balad, they call it Mortaritaville. So you'd get rockets and mortars daily, and that was just part of your thing.
Mortaritaville. That's
Mortaritaville.
Classically dark. Yeah. I love it. When you think about the invisible killers, right? I mean, you can't do a war movie really about germ theory because you can't see the germs. You can talk about it, but the idea that, Iggy Semmelweis wasn't around in 1865. He had yet to be, right, incarcerated and locked up in an insane asylum. Louis Pasteur's whole theory that we just didn't know. So you've got these invisible germs that are killing hundreds of thousands of people due to infection, and we just physically don't understand it. But how ironic today, in spite of all our enlightenment in so many ways in the medical field, to still have, a couple dozen guys killing themselves every day because of a thing we can't see. And whether it's shell shock or battle fatigue or nervous disorder or PTSD or whatever it is, look, that's really why I wanted to talk to you, Dan. Some people call you a whistleblower. The whole burn pit thing I want to jump into now because so much of what was going on, it was right in front of us, but we didn't see it. And one other quick thing, too. I don't know if this is just tragic, ironic, or weird, but from 2004 until 2007, I mean, I got a lot of mail for over a decade on dirty jobs, but the single job that was most often proposed to me was proposed by people over there fighting, who I guess it was Armed Forces TV. They got a steady diet of the Discovery Channel, and people saw a lot of dirty jobs. I can't even begin to tell you. You'll think I'm exaggerating, but it's hundreds, maybe thousands of invitations to come over and work the burn pits. guys who would watch that show would say, hey, man, love your show, but you think that's dirty? Come over here and let me introduce you to a burn pit. I didn't know what they were talking about. And to be honest, Dan, I'm still not sure I really understand what was being burned or what invisible demon was being unleashed as a result of all that fire.
Yeah, Iraq, you start a war and you go over there and you have objectives and you take over these bases. Military is really good at military operations. We're really good at look how quickly we were able to accomplish our primary objectives in Iraq. What we're not great at necessarily is now you've taken this expeditionary force, these people who are used to living out of tents, living in austere environments. You put them in this place and you got to set up a city now because you have all these operations that are going. You have tens of thousands of people on this base. And over time, you start to accumulate trash. It's not all, all flammable or highly toxic substances from planes. A lot of it's styrofoam. A lot of it is commanders saying, well, I'm not going to deploy an American citizen to go to Iraq to wash dishes and get mortared. I'm just going to use styrofoam and plastic plates and we'll get through that. That's so tons and tons of trash. Now you have this city that's got all this trash. You can't landfill the trash, or you have to expand the base and make the base bigger so you can defend a larger area. That's not workable. Burning the trash is the only thing that really made sense. It's what we've been doing since Vietnam, and it probably wasn't really good for us then either. But now you have it on this massive scale. You have all this plastic, all this styrofoam, uniforms, tires, anything that could burn. You couldn't turn that stuff over to the enemy. You couldn't turn over a scrappy uniform to the enemy that they could use, or even an ammo box. That looks familiar. They won't notice that if, that's sitting by the side of a road kind of thing. So they were burning everything that you could think of. They were burning body parts from the hospital, jet fuels, all the carcinogenic whatever trash that we had. It was all going out in that burn pit. It was so bad that when it was burning, sometimes the wind would change direction and they'd have to shut down the flight line. I used to have and that's when the commander's like, look, I'm here to fight a war. I'm not here to run a city, and there were people that were there to kind of do that, but this wasn't like a malicious commander who said, well, we can just live with the trash or whatever. This was just, it is what it is. And Iraq, you had all these people doing all these different jobs, and everyone who was there was sucking those burn pit fumes. It was common. It was around the clock kind of thing. I used to have this 7-day forecast, like you get from Weather Channel. Mm-hmm. And every day in the morning forecast, it said smoke and dust. That was that was the weather forecast for Balad for 7 straight days.
At what point do you get sucked into this, Dan? And how do you become a whistleblower?
Well, it's bizarre because I was there doing the same kind of work that I kind of do for DAV. I'm a communications kind of person. So we were doing news stories. I was escorting the media to the hospital in Iraq. And then my major calls me one day, calls our deputy in, someone else, and we sit down and he says, well, we got a job. We got this memo. And he hands out this memo. We all look at the memo. And I'm reading it in just shock, just kind of like, I'd even heard at that time that there was a memo, but I'd never seen it myself. And you're reading what Colonel Curtis wrote, and I'm just looking at this, just stunned at what an obvious problem we were dealing with. And he said, well, this is kind of basically we were the crisis communications team that was going to address this. Mm-hmm. And the goal with addressing it was to not be proactive and say, hey, look, we have this little problem in Iraq and we're trying to address it. The goal was to not have to answer any questions about it at all. Mm. It was the...
not on my watch.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. The thought was, and I even, I had that memo for a second, and we got out of that meeting, and I was scanning it to send it back to DAV. I was like, well, there's no question to me that this needs to get back home as soon as possible. And my major walks in and caught me like while I was making the scan, which is the scan that's now all over the internet. And he started looking at me, and I'm sure he got the suspicion, like, that guy's looking at me real funny and not finishing what he's doing on the scanner there. And I was like, I said, this is going to come out, right? You know that. I work for disabled American veterans in my civilian job. I'm going back there when this tour's over. And he said, as long as it doesn't happen, while I'm here, I don't really, I can extend I don't really care until we're past that part of it.
So what happens? Do you get the scan out, or do you file it away to be dealt with later?
No, it got back. I mean, it was back. Planning started right away. And so when I got back to the States, I got back in February, I think, of '08. And I worked with a journalist for Military Times called Kelly Kennedy. And we'd worked with her before a long time. She was a veteran herself. She was a disabled veteran herself. She'd gone and deployed and written a book about, she put her life on the line to tell the stories of soldiers in combat. So we felt really good about Kelly. We felt good about Military Times and being able to reach the largest audience, probably military audience, through that. So we worked with Kelly, got the story announced, and then Kelly comes back and she says, okay, all these people are now, she became a lightning rod for all these people who say, well, I got a problem, or my spouse didn't, is gone, or my spouse is dealing with this, or I'm personally dealing with this. And that's when, Kelly was like, hey, DAV, what are you going to do for these folks? And we said, well, we kind of had to approach it like we did Agent Orange, where you look at it and you say, well, what can we assume is service connected related to this? I mean, that was always the thought, was follow the Agent Orange playbook. That's why the Vietnam vets, when I got back from Iraq, were so incensed by this, was because they were looking at dioxins. They're like, well, this is Agent Orange. We can't afford, though, to go the 50 years, literally, that it took for some Agent Orange benefits to get across the plate. So Kelly started referring people to us, and we started a registry. And that registry then went on, the VA recognized, it's just like setting up for the VA. This is what needs to happen next. It can't be done by exclusively by DAV. It's, this has got to be a government effort. It's got to have that kind of resource behind it. So that was the next step, was the registry, and it was starting with legislation to, first off, let's get these burn pits that are operating wherever we can. Let's get them offline. Let's figure out a better way to deal with that problem, knowing that it's probably deadly for people. And
did that happen?
Yes, it did. It happened, but it's always the military where it can be done kind of thing, which is kind of discretionary. But I mean, I think the military, it was pretty loud and clear when the public found out that there were going to be consequences if you're running burn pits places. And but it's not totally done. I was just at an event in Chicago, and a retired colonel was telling me about his son who is in Syria right now in one of those undisclosed locations doing undisclosed work, for the government. And he's saying, well, what am I going to do with my kid who's not covered by the PACT Act, which is the legislation that was recently passed for burn pits? What am I going to do? And so then, that's a new type of fight that we're going to have to take on. And we're finding out, too, there was a base in Uzbekistan going all the way back to 2004 where we set people up. Before we went into Afghanistan, it was an old Soviet base. And they're known for their environmental concern. The Soviets are known foremost for how deeply they care about the health of their citizenry. Yeah. So this is Karsi Kanabad. K2 is what everyone calls it. I probably mispronounce it because everyone just calls it K2. But there's people, and they're talking about this, like this lake that was formed, when we were kind of cleaning up the base, and water would run in and form this little pond, and they called it Skittles Pond because it had every color in the rainbow. It's like it was toxic ooze everywhere, people getting sick before they even got into Afghanistan. So K2, now it's like K2. And, I wish there wasn't such a toxic legacy for veterans, because it's not, you don't join the military. You join the military maybe thinking, well, I'm going to meet the enemy, and that's how I'll get, if I get hurt or, God forbid, something happens, that's what's going to happen. And a lot of times it seems like it's just exposures.
How many people are now in this registry that you've put together who have been affirmatively impacted by
Boy,
this.
I wish I had that stat right now. I'm not sure how many people the VA has, but I do know that it's kind of like Agent Orange was so bad. We knew how bad Agent Orange was on a chemical level that we'd say that if you, before we even if you were off coast, which is a more recent development, but if you stepped foot on Vietnam, on shore in Vietnam, if you stepped foot at all for like 30, 40 years and went back on the ship, and that's all you ever did was you stepped foot in Vietnam, we knew Agent Orange was so bad that we had this list of diseases, and we say, well, we'll just presume that we knew how horrible this was, and this is what's going, so if you get these diseases, we're probably to blame for them. We'll own it. And I think that's where we're at kind of with burn pits now. We're saying here's a list of diseases. If you were in Iraq, you're going to qualify, and you get one of these things, we're not going to make you try and prove that it's service connected. We're just going to go ahead and take care of you. And that's why that PACT Act legislation was such a big deal. It's just, we've never been able to do something that fast before.